Priesthood Dispatches.
He's the man. It's awesome, funny, random, doesn't make any sense, but it's good.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. The date is the 10th of June, 2022. Please like and subscribe, share wherever you feel comfortable. Today we have After Dinner Chat number 22, and that will be with Steve Shields, all the way from South Korea. Steve is originally from Utah and now lives in South Korea, and he's written a book, Divergent Paths of the Restoration, an Encyclopedia to the Smith-Rigdon movement. It's now in its 5th edition. We're going to get to that interview with Steve. But before we do, we're trying to raise a little bit of money at the moment for the Priesthood Dispatches paranormal investigation. We're trying to just get together a couple of $100 to pay for some equipment and the venue. If you feel you can donate, please do so using the PayPal link in the description below. And I'll speak a little bit more about that after the episode. But for now, let's get to Steve. So, Steve, thank you for joining us today, all the way from South Korea.
Well, PD, I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Fantastic. So, Steve, what we want to do today is we want to learn more about yourself and also more about Steve's amazing book, which is The Divergent Paths of the Restoration, an encyclopedia of the Smith-Rigdon movement. If anyone after this episode is interested in the book, you can find a link to where you can purchase it in the description below. And I have been looking through the book and trying to digest as much as possible this past week. And as I've already discussed with Steve, it's just all encompassing, but it's amazing. You should really get a copy and take a look at your leisure over the coming years. And as people mention things about maybe the Bickenite movement and you never heard of it or don't know about it, you can go to the encyclopedia, and Steve has provided an amazing rundown with full references of what the Bickenite movement was and where it is now. But before we get to that, let's find out some more about Steve. So Steve, where are you from, I guess? You're in South Korea now, but where did you originate?
Well, I was born and raised in Utah. My father was a native Utah. My mother was a transplant from Colorado as a young child, but my grandmother was a native Utah, and so my parents met at Utah State. It was called Agricultural College then, now Utah State University in Logan, Utah. They were married in the Salt Lake Temple, and I came along 3 years later. So I was born in the covenant, as they used to say. I don't know if that's still a common thing on the family group sheets, but my ancestry goes all the way back to Scotland and Massachusetts.
Wow.
My English ancestors left England in 1629, I think it was, or 1628, and went to Massachusetts, which then was called the Massachusetts Bay Colony of the British Kingdom. I'm not sure what the kingdom was called in the 1600s. It's changed a few names over the years. But that family stayed in Massachusetts until my great-great-grandfather met Brigham Young and rode a horse to Kirtland, Ohio to meet Joseph Smith and was baptized there. And then he stuck with Brigham Young all the way across. My Scottish ancestors joined in 1841. So both sides of the family, the original church. And about 10 years later, they made their way from Scotland through Liverpool to the United States, and then finally to Salt Lake City across the Nebraska Trail. So I have a long heritage in both the original church and then the Utah expression of that, Brigham Young's expression of that original church. So I was raised. My father was a bishop of our ward. I did all the things that a good Mormon boy was supposed to go to BYU, and went on a mission to South Korea. And
so
that's
Do you know which part of England your ancestors came from?
Yes, they were from Norfolk,
Okay.
uh, on the eastern side of the
Yeah.
island there.
Well, Jeffrey
And
R. Holland just visited us, and he said that the best fish and chips in the UK are in Norfolk. So
well, who would argue with Elder Holland? Yeah.
no, it is nice down there. Not the part that I'm from, but it is nice down there.
My folks were dirt farmers, way back when, and probably didn't have tuppence to rub between their fingers, and so
You
they
know what?
skedaddled to the colonies.
It's it is still like that today in Norfolk. There is,
Yeah.
apart from on the coast and maybe the city of Norwich, there's not much
Um,
there. I'm sure some
yeah.
people will tell me that there is much there because they're there, and I'm sorry if I've
Sure.
offended you.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
the
yeah.
the other interesting thing is in the UK, if you are more than a third generation Mormon, that's kind of special because
Okay.
even though the church has been here since the 1840s with the missionaries that came over, they took so many people back to Utah with them
Right. Right.
that
Yep.
they didn't leave anyone behind.
Right.
And
It has been said that the population at Nauvoo at the time Joseph Smith was killed was at least a third British immigrants, and that you would just as likely hear a British accent on the street as any other.
wow,
And of course, those folks who had come to the U.S., they had nowhere to go except to follow Brigham Young. Whereas people that had been part of the church, like the Smith family and others who were part of the earlier movement in the U.S., they're the ones who became what was then known as the Reorganized Church and James Strang's church and those. So you really had two kinds of groups of people at Nauvoo. Now my great great grandfather was at Nauvoo, and his wife and Brigham Young's wife had been cousins, and that's how Brigham Young, when he went to Massachusetts, went to you go to relatives,
yeah,
and so my great great grandfather went to Kirtland, met Joseph Smith, was impressed enough to be baptized by Brigham Young in the river that's just down the hill from the Kirtland Temple in 1837. And 10 years later, he's in the vanguard company of pioneers on the way to what is now Salt Lake City. And so, I was raised to be very proud of that heritage
yeah,
because, they, and the thing of, all the religious arguments aside, the the absolute guts that those people had in the vanguard company was incredible. Um, they arrived, as we know, on July 24th, 1847, the holy, high holy day of Mormonism.
yeah.
And Brigham Young had been sick with some kind of fever. My great great grandfather was in the wagon with Brigham when he leaned up, looked over the valley, and said, "This is the right place."
Wow.
Uh, he didn't come out of his fever for another couple of days, and when he came back to his full senses and got stepped out of the tent that they'd set up for their camp and looked around, he went to Brigham and said, "Good God, Brigham, what the hell have you done to us?" No, that's apocryphal, but I can only imagine the surprise that they were.
Oh
But
my
one
God.
month later, on August 24th, Brigham Young, my great great grandfather, Albert P. Rockwood was his name, and several others got back on horses and rode all the way back to winter quarters uh, at the end of the month there. And I just making that trip back and forth. Could you do it once? But some of these guys did it twice or three times or four times. It was absolutely amazing. And that story's part of my family heritage. And but it's not just family heritage that's important in one's life. So
Yeah, I visited the Salt Lake Valley and went up to, is it up Little Cottonwood Canyon, possibly?
Mm.
Went up to the monument there where they've got
Immigration
the
Canyon.
Immigration Canyon, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
Went up there and looked at all the names and different things and read the stories.
Yep.
And that was a real testimony affirming thing for me
Yeah.
when I was there, because I felt, as I would say at the time, I felt the spirit.
Mhm.
But what I was actually feeling was a feeling of shock and awe, possibly,
Yeah.
for the great sacrifices people
Yeah.
made, you know,
Yeah.
burying children along the way
Oh
when
my, yes.
they really didn't have to. You know, it was
No, that's right. That's
such
right. Yeah.
such a sacrifice to make. And I
Yeah.
kind of, at the time, I kind of said to myself, well, we don't have mountains to cross, but we have swathes of sin to kind of swim through. Theirs was a physical
Mhm. Yeah.
challenge, and ours is
Yes.
a spiritual kind of
Mm.
challenge at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
moved on from that opinion, but at the time that was
But yeah, that
was
was a good expression of it. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, no, yeah, amazing. So
Yeah.
if you grew up in the Utah Valley, obviously you said you served your mission in South Korea, but went back to the Utah Valley.
Right.
And how have you ended up back in South Korea?
Well, uh, long story. I should say long. I try to make it short, but I don't know if I
No, you
can.
go for it. Go for it.
I uh, I had a spiritually transformative experience as a young 20-year-old missionary here in South Korea, which caused me to understand my faith in a very different way from what I'd been taught growing up. Um, I, in high school, had uh, done the church history seminary class and had always found history interesting and fascinating. And I realized when I was here that God was a much bigger entity than what I had been taught. I found people in all walks of life here who had faith, whose beliefs may not have been similar to mine necessarily, but they had hope in the future, and I had to really examine what it was I was doing, why I was doing it, and then who I was. The ultimate question, I guess, would be, who I was and where did I fit in the whole scheme of things. I didn't find out where I belonged for a few more years, um, and I had known about Community of Christ most of my growing up. We used to talk about them in Sunday school. In the LDS church, we'd talk about the RLDS church, as it was called then, the reorganized church,
Yeah.
and how foolish they were, and how false they were, and how imbued with the devil they were. I mean,
Yeah.
we did all
Me
those
too.
things.
Me too.
And as I took a look again as a young adult, I was about 25. I I found out that what our LDS Church was saying fit a lot better with my understanding of the scriptures and of God. And so I kind of tentatively put my toe into the water, so to speak. And I was in Salt Lake City at the time. So, I was right in the belly of the beast, as somebody once said.
Wow.
I was threatened with my job by my employer that if I were to join that church, it would be very difficult for me to continue working in his company. And I I finally took the leap, or took the plunge, I guess, and was baptized. It's been about 40. Let me think. About 40 plus years ago, and uh, ultimately, I was not fired from my job. My employer kind of came around to thinking and realized that I was doing a good job for him, and it really didn't matter where I went on Sunday mornings. Ultimately, finally, and so I was
Yeah.
grateful for that. An opportunity came up in the late 80s for me to serve Community of Christ in a full-time capacity, and so I did, and went to Los Angeles, where I pastored a small congregation that was needing to be replanted in a new location. And after several years in Los Angeles, about 9, I think it was, an opportunity came for me to come back to Korea as pastor of Community of Christ congregation in Korea. So I've been a missionary for 2 different denominations here in Korea. So I did that for a number of years, and then I did other things. I've spent about 10 years after I was in Korea the second time. I was here for 8 or 9 years at the second time. I spent 10 years traveling throughout all of Asia doing training for our local church leaders for Community of Christ. So, Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal. I spent almost 10 years running around all those places doing in-service training, basically, for people. And I retired in 2016, and after a couple of years still in the Kansas City area, that's where I was living. I was working out of church headquarters at the time. I realized I really wanted to spend more years in Korea in retirement, and so I just moved myself back, and I came back. I moved back 4 years ago, and I take an active role in the congregation that I used to be the pastor of. It's a Korean church. As a senior person, my role is to help the younger priesthood members learn their duties and do their ministry. So I take a turn speaking on Sunday mornings once in a while, and lately I've been teaching the children's Sunday school class, the little kids, and I really enjoy that. They're kind of like surrogate grandchildren for me. My grandkids are in the U.S., and so I've been in Community of Christ now, I think 40 years, 41 years this year maybe, and
Wow.
that I found that to be the spiritual home that I had been looking for, and it's been a very safe place for me to explore my faith, express my faith, and you can talk with many colleagues and friends in the church, and they'll tell you that sometimes Steve Shields is way out in left field with his ideas, but it's okay, and that's what really keeps me going.
You know what? We had another member of the Community of Christ on a few weeks ago. We had Stacey Cram come and join us, and me and another podcaster from here in the UK, Nemo the Mormon, interviewed her. And what we found so refreshing was exactly what you just said. It is okay to disagree.
Yeah.
And we can talk about it. A conversation can be had rather than disagree at your peril.
Several years ago, 15 years ago maybe, I was working at headquarters. Another colleague who's a little younger was there. He's now a member of the 12 Apostles. But the president of the church introduced a new video that they just made to try and be kind of a fresh approach and attract young adults and whatever. And there was a moment in it where these two people were running towards each other in a very slow, and it was reminiscent of a hair product commercial of my teenage years. And I went back to my office and fired off an email to the president of the church and said, Steve, you've got to be kidding. It reminded me of this hair product commercial. And unbeknownst to me, this other colleague, who he and I are almost on the same page with those things, did the same thing. And the next day, we were at a leaders meeting. The next day, the president of the church sought us out, and he said, as that video came out and I saw that scene, I said, I knew that one or both of you were going to send me an email. He says, how I do that, I don't know. And I said, well, that must be the spirit of prophecy and revelation, Steve. So Steve Veazey's just, he and I are about the same age. He's maybe a year or two younger than me, and we've worked together in the church in various capacities over the last. He's a really good guy, and you know, but even that kind of thing, didn't faze him. They ultimately didn't release the video, and I don't think it was just because of me. but Stacy Cram, who's presiding bishop and a counselor in the First Presidency at the same time, I've known Stacy probably about 30 years also, from the time she was a local pastor, all through her career, and she's top-notch people. I was really glad when I heard that she was on your program. That's good. I'm glad she was available for that. So
Yeah, well, it was amazing. I was at a Sunstone conference here in the UK, and Stacy appeared by a video link, and she read out her email address, and I thought, well, I'm going to test this, because obviously from a Brighamite sect point of view, you never get the email address for a member of the First Presidency.
Right. Yep.
So I just sent her a simple thank you, and she replied to me within the hour.
That's amazing.
Saying,
when I say it's amazing, it's that the timing worked out. I mean, I think all of them eventually get to their emails, but they are very busy, and they do get lots of email.
No, yeah, absolutely. Well,
so accessible.
Yeah, and she was quite happy to come on a live stream and be questioned, and gave a very good showing of the community of Christ. Have you met with Andrew Bolton before?
Well, yeah, Andrew was my supervisor for a few years, as my apostle. So yes, I know Andrew very well. Yeah.
Andrew and Pearl. He likes to argue. I know that much.
Oh yes. he and I had plenty of those discussions.
Yeah. No,
he once said to me, he said, Steve, he said, I think you're in the most liberal 5% of the liberal population of Community of Christ. I'm not sure that he meant it as a compliment, but I took it as such. And I said, oh, thank you very much for recognizing that.
No, awesome. I know that if I've ever got any Community of Christ questions, I just fire them off to Andrew. But I'll copy you in now as well, and you guys can reconnect.
Oh dear, yeah. No, he and I are in touch occasionally, and we have similar interests in church history and things like that. But he's retired now. I'm retired, and he lives. Well, I think he's living mostly in Leicester, England, and spends a little bit of time still back in Missouri. But the miles are time change too is kind of hard to keep in touch much. But anyhow, yeah. That's a long story. I'm sorry. I told you I couldn't. I tried to make it short, but I wasn't successful.
No, I think understanding the background to your story helps us understand the book as well. So it's always important to understand, especially where you're standing within Mormonism now. Some people stand looking in from outside, like myself, and have chosen to step that way. And others, now knowing that you're in the Community of Christ, we can see where your, I guess, point of view is, and biases. Yeah. But we'll get there. So you leaving the church in the Salt Lake Valley, you said that your employer obviously had issues but overcame them. Were there any other? How were your family with it?
Well, my siblings. I have 3 siblings, and they're kind of a mixed lot. One sibling is more Mormon than President Nelson, and I have a Catholic friend that's more Catholic than the Pope. It took me a minute to get it into Mormon speak. And another sister who is very actively engaged in her local ward and very much a believer, and another sibling who says, I'm done with it all. It's my parents, both of whom are deceased now, had terrible struggles with what I'd done. My mother she said, I knew when you started reading those books that weren't approved by Deseret Book that something like this would happen. And this was, this was 50 odd years ago. If it's not approved by Deseret Book, maybe you should be reading the books, is my opinion. But my parents remained very faithful and active till the days they died. And, they eventually came around to simply dealing with the fact that, I was excommunicated. At the time when that all came down, I asked to resign my membership. And technically on the rule book, they were supposed to be able to do that, but the stake president was ignorant of the rules, I guess. I later had a conversation with one of the first quorum of the 70, and told him that story. And he said, well, Steve, he says, see, for that timeline, that's wrong. They should have simply took your resignation. He said, I'm going to check the records and fix that for you. And now I've never followed up to see if he has, because my parents are gone. It doesn't matter to me. Yeah. But when my mother saw that I had been blotted out of the family's information on the church database, it was very upsetting for her. And that happened just before she died. And I'm convinced that she has ordered my younger brother to do temple work for me again when I die. But he doesn't confess that, and I don't know. But that's something my mother would do. My dad, after my mother died, I had fallen out with Dad, and I decided I needed to reconcile with him. And he was in a nursing home not far from my baby sister's house, and so I made special efforts to travel to see them, and stay at my sister's house, and she could transport me around. And trying to figure out how to communicate and get chummy with Dad in his older age, where his mind was starting to kind of he didn't have Alzheimer's, but it didn't always register the time-space continuum. And so I thought maybe the best way that I could be with him for that was to go to their sacrament meeting at the nursing home. And so I did, and I went down, had breakfast with him, and then we got into the common room, and I'm kind of sitting by the wall, and he's here, and they serve the sacrament, and they serve him, and then they reach the tray to me with the bread, and my dad grabbed the hand of the guy serving the sacrament and said, "He can't have any. He's an apostate." And the whole room, of 150 people turns and looks at me. And it just happened in Utah, at least in the nursing homes. The stakes kind of adopt a nursing home, and they call someone to be the branch president of that nursing home. Happened to be a really good friend from church history circles, from Mormon History Association circles, who was serving as the branch president at that very day that I was there. And I had not met him yet. I'd showed up, and I recognized him from afar, and he came over after. He said, "Steve, it's so good to see you." He said, "Was a bit awkward though, wasn't it?" Because he had known me for many years. He knew my story. He knew my parents. He'd been a professor at Weber State University in Ogden, and just a wonderful man. And it was really, do I dare say, God's providence that he was there at that experience, because it really helped me not even worry about what my dad had said. And I continued, when I visit, I would continue to go to sacrament meetings, and Dad never had to say anything again, because I would take my Starbucks coffee cup with me, and that would be my sacrament while they had bread and water.
Wow.
So I'm sorry. I'm just, I just can't stop.
You know what? I'm just as bad. My parents were the temple president, and they got a nice house, big house behind the temple on the temple grounds. Right. Yes. So for those years, all family events were the temple because it was
Sure. Yeah, well,
large family, large
that's where they
house.
live. Yep.
You know, the church would provide everything, and yeah, it was fantastic. But on occasion, say Christmas, family gatherings, I wanted to have a little bit of something in my drink, so I'd
A
sneak it in
little
my
bit of
pants.
something, I see.
So I'm probably the only person to have got merry in the temple president's house. And I hope my dad's not watching this, actually. I apologize.
Oh dear.
Oh dear.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I could, because I'm an ordained minister. I'm a
Can you
high
absolve me
priest,
of that sin?
so I can absolve you of that problem. Uh,
Fantastic. I feel so
well,
much better.
there's we each kind of have to deal with those stresses in our own life. Now, I don't want all this to be negative, because I have found, even in my transition from Utah LDS to Missouri LDS, so to speak, um, the bishop who processed my excommunication, or that stuff, has remained a close friend to this day. We're in touch. This was, like I say, 40 years ago plus, and he was very kind and very loving, and he didn't. He said the things that a bishop is supposed to say to people. Well, we wish that your decision would be something else, but he was supportive of me as a human being, as a child of God. He and his wife later became a temple president and matron in Papeete, Tahiti. And I had the great privilege of being able to travel to Tahiti on church business for us. But before I went, um, he'd gone to this temple president had gone to a meeting in Papeete, kind of an ecumenical gathering, and the churches in Papeete are really, really quite closely working together: Mormon, Catholic, Protestant, whatever. And there was a woman from our church headquarters that he had known through church music circles, and he saw her on the front row, and went over to her and chatted, and turned to the Tahitian church leader that she was with, and he said, "By any chance, do you know Steve Shields?" And this Tahitian church leader said, "Mais oui." He's a good friend. And so, not long after that, when I went to Tahiti, he just he was calling the Community of Christ Mission Office just about every day, trying to make, didn't want to miss me. Did Steve arrive yet? When's he supposed to arrive? And I had arrived in the middle of the night. I'd gone over on the next morning, and I hadn't been in the office for 30 minutes. The phone rings, and the receptionist said, "This phone call's for you." It's like, who's calling me? It was this temple president's former bishop, who was such a dear friend. And he said, "When can we have you up to the house?" And, the mission, or the temple president's house, is above on the hill, spectacular view over the city and the bay outside of the city. And they just absolutely loved being there. And I was so grateful to still be welcome in their home. And, so, I mean, and through church history circles, I've come to know 2 or 3 of the official LDS church historians who are members of the first quorum of the 70, who the 2 that are my best friends are both Democrats, which is unusual amongst LDS church leaders. Maybe that's why we got along so well. I don't know, but I've been so grateful for their testimonies, for their kindness, and for their Christ-like approach to me as an individual. So, despite my, shall I say, arguments or disagreements, and where I felt like I needed to go, there still are some really fine people. I don't, I just, I have it really, it's really hard for me to be an anti-Mormon. I just, I can talk about what I don't think is right, but it's life's too short to spend that kind of negative energy, and I'm
Yeah.
grateful that there have been positives in that whole experience. So anyway, that's
No, well, that's great. My priesthood leaders won't talk to me because I emailed them my opposition at General Conference to the first presidency as instructed, and yeah, they won't talk to me now. But I think if you're friends beforehand, I think it's good to be friends after. Whereas I didn't really know them; they just
yeah,
saw me as a dissenter. Um,
right,
but before we move on to the book, I think
yeah,
something interesting I found about the community of Christ
okay,
was the difference in the pastor and the bishop. Because when, as
um,
a Brighamite, you think
right,
of pastor and you're thinking kind of, I don't know, Southern Baptist maybe, or
right,
um,
right, 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 yeah.
but the original church actually had pastors and bishops. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. The
Oh well.
original church had branch presidents
Oh, okay.
or presiding elders and bishops. The bishop was not the uh, caregiver or caretaker of a branch or a congregation. And I can say that when I'm talking about the LDS Church, he was responsible for the temporal well-being of people in his ward. And ward was a new term that came to place in Nauvoo because the state of Illinois had their political divisions in cities were called wards.
Okay.
And so ward was not an ecclesiastical term originally. So in Nauvoo, you had 4 wards, and those corresponded with the voting districts for election
Yeah.
purposes and city council representation. To this day, Chicago is still divided into wards. And when the city of Chicago has elections for city council members, they call them aldermen or alderwomen now of Ward X. So that Nauvoo civic organization ends up going to Salt Lake City, what is now Salt Lake City, with those who followed Brigham Young. Um, the bishops in early Utah history uh, were responsible for the temporal well-being of the people in their ward. They did not have separate sacrament meetings. There were some ward houses that were built in the pioneer era, but everyone went to sacrament meeting at Temple Square who lived in Salt Lake City. And they originally built a Bowery, then they built the old tabernacle, then the domed new tabernacle, and everyone went there for sacrament meeting well into the early 1900s. The stake had an organization. There was and that's who was conducting. The whole stake would meet for sacrament meetings, and this happened in the other towns too. Most cities in Utah had stake tabernacles. Now, most of those have all been taken down. There's still a few that remain, but they were remodeled into local ward houses. They might call them a stake center still. But in every town in Utah, everybody went down to the tabernacle in their town for sacrament meetings, which were conducted by the stake presidency. Um, the transformation into where the bishop became the dual pastor of a congregation or presiding elder of a branch and the temporal needs took place over a couple of generations probably. And I don't know the exact history of that, but I would say probably into the early 1900s at least, the bishops were not presiding over weekly sacrament meetings. Um, and Salt Lake City was divided into wards, both ecclesiastically and civilly. A few years ago, I went to a history conference, and a young man had done some research on the different homes that the RLDS branch in Salt Lake City had. And one of those, right around the turn of the 20th century, was in the 14th Ward schoolhouse. And this young man had not done his research, and he was mystified as to why the 14th Ward would rent their schoolhouse building to this apostate group. Well, the 14th Ward schoolhouse didn't belong to the church. It belonged to the 14th Ward of the city. It was the public schoolhouse. And so the RLDS church was renting the schoolhouse from the city, not from the Mormon ward that was across the street. And so that line that's disappeared, and they don't, Salt Lake City is no longer divided into wards for civic purposes. It's just, ecclesiastical. So the bishop in Community of Christ remained as in the old days, where the bishop had a larger oversight and dealt almost exclusively with financial matters and temporal well-being of people, including, the holding titles to the buildings that were built and facilitating all of that. And so that structure remains today. So the presiding bishop in Community of Christ, just like their counterparts in Salt Lake City, are presidents of the presidency of the Aaronic priesthood.
Yep.
And the presiding bishopric in Salt Lake City deal with all the church properties and those financial matters. And so, but the local ward bishop in the LDS church deals with both spiritual and temporal needs. And the system has worked well. My granddad was ward bishop of his ward for 20 some years back in the 1920s till World War II started, between 1 and 2. My dad was bishop of our ward when I was a kid, and they did spend a lot of time dealing with people in the ward who needed help.
Yeah.
But they also led sacrament meetings and dealt with those kinds of things too. So that's a difference in the structure.
Yeah.
We've adopted the term pastor just so that instead of presiding elder or branch president, we've just simply moved into a more commonly understood terminology. You say I'm pastor of a congregation, and almost anybody knows what that means.
Yeah.
If you say I'm the presiding elder of a branch, they look at you like, and not all of our congregations would have been called branches. There were some that were bigger, and so it just, I don't know, probably in the 80s or 90s, we kind of just gradually switched over to where pastor became the general moniker for those who were leading. But even so, most of them are volunteers, just like the bishops are in the LDS church. Some, I don't know how many congregations we've got worldwide. In the U.S., there's close to 2,000 at least. Maybe not quite that many, but in all these different countries, and most of the local leaders are volunteers. There's a few at the next higher level that are staff, but even in most places, the mission center president, which would be equivalent to a stake president in the LDS church, most of those are volunteers too. So we don't. I get this all the time from LDS people. Well, your church is wrong because you have a paid ministry. It's like, we don't have as many people on our payroll as you do.
Absolutely. No, I was a bishop in the UK, and to have someone to share the load with would have been amazing, because to look after the spiritual and physical welfare of a ward is two full-time jobs.
It's a big job. Yeah.
I genuinely think a paid ministry is required, at least in some respects.
Yeah.
Because to have volunteers running the church all the way up to Salt Lake, you're leaving it in the hands of kind of untrained, well-meaning brethren.
Exactly. Yep.
But sometimes we end up in situations where our actual job doesn't give us the skills required to handle and deal with that. And I was in those situations. I was a very young bishop at 23, had no life experience and no training. and ended up in
Wow.
some really sticky situations.
Well, even a pastor who has had training and maybe salaried and working full time in that role, I've been there,
Yeah,
and it's still hard. It's more than a full time job,
yeah,
and you have in any group of people, in any congregation, any ward, you've got well, in an LDS ward, typically there's around 400 members roughly in the U.S.
in the
expressions that I'm
US.
familiar with. Um, but even if you only have 100, you've got 2,000 problems with 100 people.
Yeah,
So if you have 400 people in the ward, you've got,
yeah.
and there's always a handful of well-intentioned dragons
Oh,
among the members. Um, they, uh, they are a dime a dozen, and bless their hearts, they're trying to do the right thing, and they really are sincere and devout, but they just upset the apple cart every time you turn around,
let,
and you've got to deal with all that.
let me tell
So,
you this. We had a family, and now I grew up in the church where my dad told me, "You never say no to the bishop.
yeah,
Whenever a call comes, it's from the Lord. You never say no." And
sure,
it was always just understood that when there was a sustaining vote, you always sustained, you always thanked. You never
yeah,
had a problem with it because the bishop was saying so. Okay.
right, right,
Went to
right,
this
yeah.
new ward where my wife is from, and it was unreal. People would just oppose all the time. Even when
Wow,
even when I was called as bishop, fortunately I was sat towards the front of the chapel. People were opposing behind me. And I'm like, "Whoa." When I
very
found,
interesting.
yeah, so the state president took me to one side afterwards, and they sat me down and said, "Okay, this person's opposed. Where the state president's going to speak with them now. Can you tell
Yeah.
us about anything that they might know that
Okay, sure.
will
Yeah,
surprise us or that will
yeah,
preclude your call?" And
right.
it turned out to be nothing. But in that ward,
Yeah.
the they'd seen people oppose that many times that it just became a
Oh,
thing that you just did it.
huh.
So, but there was one family that, as you say, would, if it wasn't their way, it was the wrong way. And in this ward, we had about 500 people on the rolls, and about 60 would come to church. So we were doing a lot
Okay,
of work to try and clean up the rolls and
sure. Yeah,
to find people. But on a
yeah.
Sunday, we'd got quite a large chapel, and
Hmm.
people were really spread out.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what I decided was we would close off a small portion at the back of the chapel because it was kind of one of their multi-purpose, the big
Sure.
golden screens that
The
come
doors.
across. Yeah,
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yep.
we
Standard equipment in LDS buildings.
yeah. So
Yep.
we'd pull them across because
Yep.
it probably only cut out 5 or 6 rows at the back,
Right.
but
Right.
it would force everyone to come into the chapel and be together and
Yep.
singing together rather than trying to fill this cavernous
Kind of.
space.
Yep. Yep.
Well,
Yeah.
there was one family, and it
All
wasn't
that.
just so, and it
Oh,
was
gee.
wasn't just a family. It was the parents, and they'd all got 4 or 5 kids, who also had partners and their children who
Oh
sat in
my.
that space, and
Wow.
that was their
Yep.
space.
That was their space. Oh my.
And
Whoa.
they were so upset with it that even when the screens were closed, they would still sit in their space behind the screens for sacrament meeting.
Oh my gosh. Oh
And
jeez.
it was
Oh
like
yeah.
a
Yeah.
Mexican standoff. They were playing chicken to basically say, "No, we don't agree, and you will
Yeah.
open the screens if you want us to take part." And I was sat there on the stand saying, "This is ridiculous. I'm not
Yeah.
opening the screens because they'll ride roughshod over me for the next 5 years if I do."
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then they started complaining because the young men weren't bringing the sacrament in. Because I said to
Okay.
them, we only serve the sacrament to people in the chapel and nursing mothers.
Yeah.
So serve in the chapel, go up to the mother's lounge and see if there's anyone around that requires the sacrament. And
Yep.
if anyone else wants it, they can come into the chapel and get it.
Yeah.
Oh, the pure bloody mindedness was unreal, and that was just one of many.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But we
Yeah.
have
Well,
the ward system here in the UK. It's the we don't have aldermen anymore, but they used to be aldermen going way back. But we still have the
sure. Okay.
wards with
Okay. And
councillors.
the city divisions. Yes. Okay. All right.
Yeah, all over. The whole country is divided into wards and
Uh-huh.
councils.
Okay.
So I always thought that was a weird juxtaposition with the church and the wards. But
Yeah.
now that you say where it comes from, it makes total sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It was
Okay.
very
Yeah.
practical
Yeah.
organization. So
Well, it's your ward,
yeah.
isn't it? It's your responsibility.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it must come from the old English to take a ward.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah. It had to come from England because that's the United States basically was modeled on England, except we didn't want a king.
and we well, no, I like the royal family, but yeah,
I
it's
rather
they
enjoyed
don't really do
the old
anything now.
with Paddington Bear and the Queen the other day.
But did you see that? That was
Yes. Oh, yes, that was delightful.
I was impressed that she did it, to be honest with you.
I was too. It's like, this gal's got something going on for her. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway,
I'm just pulling up. Okay. Okay, everyone, bear with me one moment. We are about to move on to the fabulous book that Steve has written, going by the name of The Divergent Paths of the Restoration. And hopefully we can see it on the screen in a moment. Here we go. So here at Goodreads, $5, everyone. I'll put the link in the description below, or $8.49 on Kindle. It is definitely worth it. The Divergent Paths of
what's
the Restoration.
$5?
Sorry?
Is it five? No, it's not $5. What's that? Oh, it's five. Oh,
Oh, 5-star
5 star.
rating. 5-star
Wow.
rating. Even better.
Oh,
It's
wow. That's amazing. Wow.
$8.49 on Kindle. And I'd give it a 5-star rating as well. In fact, I will go on to
Well, thanks very much indeed.
I got mine from Apple Books. I'll
Okay.
go on there and give it a rating. But yes, please go on wherever
Yeah,
you get your Kindle
Amazon
book.
has it. Barnes and Noble has it on their format. So I mean, whatever format people want. Yeah.
Yeah. But this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
It's got the green cover and the picture of Joseph Smith. Silhouette. That's the word I was looking for, of Joseph Smith. But we're going to get into this now and take a look. We won't ruin it for you because there is so much in there. But I picked out a few bits to talk about.
Okay.
So before we do, when did you start writing the book?
I started writing the book when I was a senior in high school.
Wow.
I was 16 and a half, 17 maybe. In Utah, the seminary program the seminaries are adjacent to the high school campuses, and students are able to take one period a day from high school and go across and get their Mormon training. I didn't want to miss out on my academics, and so I went to early morning seminary, still at the building adjacent to the high school. So it was just, I wasn't having to go distance. Once I got there, I was at school. The seminary teachers all ganged up on us and felt like those who did early morning seminary could handle more work, and so they made us do term papers, which most people in daytime classes never had to do. So by the time I finished 3 years of seminary, I'd done 12 term papers, and I was running dry. But as my senior year seminary class was church history, I just one day cleaning out my cupboard at home, came across a stack of tracts that I'd picked up at the Kirtland Temple a year or two prior. And I'd been rather disturbed by these tracts. Here's this apostate group claiming Joseph Smith, and I thought that was just really obnoxious of them. And so I wrote a term paper on how foolish and false the RLDS church was, and all the seminary teachers loved it. So I was reading the paper to classes, And they were applauding my wonderful arguments about why the RLDS Church was false. And in one of the classes, one of the kids said, well, I was in Independence last summer with my family, and there's another church there that claims Joseph Smith too. And so I said, oh, there's my second term paper right there. It's the Church of Christ on the Temple Lot. So I began working on, well, it just snowballed. And the first edition of Divergent Paths was published at the end of my freshman year at BYU. So I'd spend all of my weekend hours working on that book in the library, doing the research, writing letters back and forth to these different church people who were around. And here we are, almost 50 years later, and we've done the 5th edition. That's, it started from a early morning seminary term paper project. And basically it's the only thing I've really ever done in church history, because it's been completely life consuming, but I don't regret that. I've met hundreds of fascinating people, prophets and presidents and apostles, and you name the lot. Some of them are despicable people. Most of them are wonderful people who are kind-hearted, try to follow a Christ-like life, and then, digging into the history for those that are no longer around, trying to track down who they were and what they were about and where they were and so on. But it's, I just, and working on edition 5 took me about 10 years to do it, because I decided to rewrite the whole thing from the beginning.
Wow.
Rather than just add to what I had done in the 4th edition. It needed a rewrite. And it needed a better way of sourcing information, needed some kind of a system to try and keep track of everybody. Pure chronology wasn't necessarily accurate, because you'd disconnect some of the groups that sprang from groups that sprang from groups that sprang from groups. And so I came up with a system that is not perfect. My decimal numbering system's not perfect, but it was a way to get a handle on sometimes multiple generations out of one expression. And trying to sort all that out, and sometimes people would be here and then they'd be over there and back here again, and nothing's a straight line. So
Yeah.
it just needed to be redone. And I started the project in 2006 with 18 large cartons full of file folders on the floor of my study, and just slogging through it all bit by bit, page by page, piece by piece. And
Wow.
I was just, and finally I got it done, and I said, I've got to stop somewhere, because these groups are going to continue to emerge, and I can't just I've got to stop and get it published. Then we go on from there. But I was very grateful to Signature Books for tackling the project, albeit they decided only to do the ebook format. But at more than 1,000 pages, a printed book would have had to be 2 volumes, and that would have upped the price and made it less accessible. But I have a good friend who's an editor, and I asked her once about the Chicago Manual of Style that we use in the U.S. a lot, and it's that thick. And I said, well, it's online. What do you prefer? And she said, if it doesn't break my toe when I drop it, I don't trust it. So, so I'm that way with my book too. It's like, well, I know it's the 21st century and ebooks and all that and the other, but I guess I'm more touchy-feely than I thought.
It'd be nice to have a small run of hardbacks.
Yeah.
Well,
it's out there. People apparently are liking it. If I got a 5-star rating, that's wow.
Yeah. No, it's
surprised.
It's good. What was the reaction to the book from both the Brighamite Utah Church and from the Community of Christ?
Um, well, it's always been well received in the church history communities, uh, and there's never been any official. I would say that most Community of Christ church leaders know who I am, and so they know the book. Most LDS church leaders wouldn't have a clue who I was or know about the book,
Yeah.
unless they're in the church history department at church headquarters, and some of those folks know me well, and uh, so but uh, I've never I've had a couple of complaints in earlier editions which I tried to resolve, where I hadn't done my homework as thoroughly as I should have, and I've tried to correct those deficiencies. But like Moroni says in the Book of Mormon, and whether it doesn't matter how you look at the Book of Mormon, historical or not, the wisdom
Yep.
that he says, if there are mistakes, it's because I'm human.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And so I've said the same thing in the 5th edition. It's like I've tried hard, but inevitably there'll be mistakes. So just acknowledge that, and if you let me know, I'm happy to correct it next time around. I'm learning still, and
I think that is being able to say either I don't know or I'm happy to be corrected is very refreshing when you come from a Mormonism background where it's constantly I know, and
mm,
you cannot question authority. So
mm,
that's
yeah, well, very, yeah,
but going to Moroni, I think it's interesting when I speak to members of the church or the Utah sect, because the church goes heavy on Moroni's promise, and the whole
oh
thing
yeah,
around missionary work is Moroni's
right,
promise, proving
right,
the Book of Mormon as the fruits of Joseph Smith, and that
yeah,
proves that the Brighamite sect is true.
right, yeah,
Because in the Brighamite sect, you have no idea of any of these other churches. You've heard of the RLDS, but
and maybe, yeah. Other than
yeah,
that, no, yeah,
you've no idea. You just think that the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith is this one church only, and that there was nothing else. That no
yeah,
other church uses the Book of Mormon. But I've said to my family members, yes, if you believe the Book of Mormon is true, fantastic. Now you have to figure out which sect that uses the Book of Mormon is true.
yeah,
So
yeah.
go and test the fruits of Brigham Young,
Yeah.
because they're a bit off.
Now this is pre-pandemic because 2 years ago, the whole world changed for us.
Yeah.
But before that, I would occasionally see LDS missionaries on the street, and they would see another non-Korean looking person. I can't really hide out in the crowd here. And they'd often come up to me and say, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And just, I'd be friendly. And they'd say, well, have you ever heard of the Book of Mormon? And I said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, I have. Oh, you have? And I said, yes, I used to be one of you when I was 19 and 20. Oh, wow. Oh, that's great. And I said, but now I left the church. And oh no, that's so sad. And and they flipped the Book of Mormon. Haven't you read Moroni's promise and prayed about that? And I said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, I have many times. And I was told to leave the Mormon church and join another one. And I do that just kind of to be in their face. And it's not very kind of me, I know. But they're kind of taken aback by that. And they said, well, what about, and they start trying to flip through different, I said, dude, I've read the book hundreds of times. I know all of those verses, and they just can't conceive. And
No.
okay, they're 19, they're 20.
Yeah.
They're I was like that when I was 19 and 20, and I think back of some of the experiences that I had as a young LDS missionary here in Korea, and I kind of slap my head and say, oh my gosh, I didn't do that, did I? Yeah, I did. So, what do you do? I usually try to be nicer to people, but sometimes I'm
Yeah.
sorry. That
Well,
may not be a
if it was me, I would carry pass-along cards with an email address on to say, if you email me, I'll email you a free copy of
Okay. Yes.
the book as a missionary for you to look at,
Yep.
as a missionary tool.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
it's yeah. But
Anyway.
I
Yeah.
guess if I've got this visual that we looked at a little bit
Okay.
earlier.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah. That really kind of shows in a visual way a lot of and I can see here, PD, that you've got a line coming down and then some jogs up and then some more jogs up, and that gets to what I was saying earlier about those different generational expressions. And so yeah,
yeah.
you've done a good visual here.
Well,
Yeah.
it's not mine. I've downloaded it from the
Oh.
internet. So I'll
Oh.
leave
Okay.
for anyone who wants to look
Oh.
at it. I will put a
Yeah.
link in the description below to where you can find this
Well, I wonder who's done
visual.
this. They've done a pretty good job of it.
Yeah,
You'd think maybe they had my book as a way to start.
quite possibly.
Who did this?
Quite possibly.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
So
it could be my friend John Hamer,
John
who,
Hamer, possibly.
yeah, he may have done this
Yeah,
because he's well versed. He's well versed in all this. He's one of the few people that he and I can actually talk about the entire book and know all the details inside. It's just, there's so much information there, and he's like a sponge.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, I think the
but
three
yeah,
I've kind of broken it into three or maybe four areas. We've got here,
hmm
which is the you've called it the original church era, which is
right,
pre 1844,
right,
and then you've got the fragmentation era up to the 1860s here,
right,
and
yeah,
then post 1920. We obviously get the polygamous break off in
right,
1920, and then you've got
right.
this kind of common era here, more recent
Mm,
break-offs. But if we
mm,
look first, because I found it very interesting that there were break-offs pre 1844. I was always taught just about the RLDS and that
okay.
Sidney Rigdon was deceived by Satan and deceived the Smith family and took them away to the RLDS. And Brigham Young
Mm,
took on the image of Joseph. And
yeah.
yeah, that's kind of where
Yeah.
my understanding came from. So when I looked at this and realized that there were actual breakaways before Joseph Smith died, that shocked me a
Mm,
little
mm.
bit. And I'd like to ask you about a couple of them.
Okay.
The first one that stuck out to me was Black Pete.
Yeah. Yeah. And Black Pete, was he really a break off or was he something else?
Yeah,
He was a African slave stock. Uh, when the church first got to Ohio, there was this outpouring of charis, charismatic spirit, and so you had Black Pete, you had Mrs. Hubble, Laura Hubble, Hiram Page, was getting revelations from a seer stone, and there was this free spirited movement, and people were not necessarily breaking away from the church. They were just following some spiritual line that was compatible with what Joseph Smith had been talking about, angels and visitations and revelations. But Joseph tried to put a stop to it all and said, no, only me can give revelations for the church, and tried to squelch that charismatic outpouring that had become pretty prevalent in 1831 and 2 in Kirtland. Um, by 36, when the temple was dedicated, you don't see, you see other groups that set up separate, but it wasn't for charismatic reasons.
Yeah.
Uh, those early expressions of that outpouring of the Holy Spirit, kind of reminiscent of what happened on the day of Pentecost in some ways to the early apostles. Uh, but spiritualism and this kind of stuff, the whole area where Joseph was in New York, Pennsylvania, all through his era and well into the early 1900s, was this the spiritual cauldron. There were dozens upon dozens of people communicating with the other side and receiving visitations and visions. And um, so there was just something, I think, inherent in those early people, which have been called seekers by some in the Mormon history community, uh, that, they were looking for that sort of charismatic connection. Uh, and so, Black Pete was one of those.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about him. There just isn't much more uh, than that. So
Yeah, and I think from some of them, you've noted the independent church who
right,
were upset with the worldly kind of actions of Joseph and the
yeah,
church leaders, but they came from a Quaker background,
right, yeah,
so
yeah,
you'd understand that they were quite strict.
yeah,
So
very
when
strict, very, yeah,
Yeah, so when people are coming into this new church from other religious backgrounds, you've got them maybe having some issues with assimilating with the new leadership styles because Joseph was a
yeah,
charismatic leader and
yes,
was a socialite.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
One that I thought was interesting with Warren Parrish in
yeah,
1837, 1838, around the Kirtland
right,
Banking Society.
yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
That whole incident was, the Kirtland Anti-Banking Company.
Yes.
Uh, because they couldn't get a license to actually have a bank, they just made up their own bank.
Yeah.
And Warren Parrish had been the treasurer. He was a faithful member of the church, and when the books didn't balance, the only possible culprits were Joseph Smith and Smith-Rigdon, whose names were signed on all the banknotes.
Yes.
Uh, and so that whole economic thing came to a terrible head, and Parrish and those who had basically lost all of their money to this anti-banking company said, "We're done. We're done with you, Joseph and Sidney. You guys are thieves,
Yeah.
and the church doesn't need the likes of you." And so they tried to do something on their own, but without that charismatic leader,
Yeah.
you don't get too far. They didn't
Yeah.
get far with that. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I think because there was some counterclaim from Joseph against them or
that's right.
against him as the treasurer. And did he
Right.
take
Yeah.
three apostles with him as well?
I believe that's correct. I think 3 of the 12 went with Parrish
Yeah.
uh,
And I
against
think
Joseph Mississippi.
I think this was the point that kind of triggered the 1838 revelations around the priesthood and Joseph having received the priesthood and being the only one with the authority. It was the great
Right.
apostasy kind of
Right.
thing, that the church
Yeah.
survived it, but Joseph put his foot down and made it so that no one could break away again because they would not
Yeah.
have the authority that came through him.
Right. That's
But we
right.
see that
Yeah.
people did. Um,
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that it was 1838 also when the name of the church was changed. Again, not the first time.
yeah,
Uh, and it was 1838 when the church was to be called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
yeah,
And that's all caught up in that whole milieu of what was going on and how Joseph was trying to assert, uh, final authority
yeah,
over the church. I mean, I don't have any criticism of him doing that. It was his baby,
yeah,
So But because of that, you end up with people that were uncomfortable, and we lost the whole Whitmer family over it.
Yeah.
They said, no, that's not what was intended back when, because the Whitmers were right there on the ground floor, and they didn't like Sidney-Rigdon anyway. So yeah, it was a tough time.
Okay. Well, another one that surprised me was this one, the True Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And this was probably
Yeah,
the one that has had the most impact upon Mormonism, in my opinion, because this is the one that triggered the martyrdom of
that's
Joseph
right.
Smith.
Yep,
And this
that's right.
one was William Law and his brother.
William Law. Yep, and his brother,
Um,
the Fosters and the Higbees, six man. William Law had been a counselor in the First Presidency. Earlier in 1844, Joseph had basically released him from that. And there were rampant rumors of marital infidelity running around town. Joseph being the leader of the pack, and William Law and the others said, no, this is not. We're not okay with all this, and so they published their one and only issue of the Nauvoo Expositor.
mm-hmm.
And Joseph, in his role as mayor, said they're a public nuisance, and so a team of people went up to the Expositor printing office and pied the type, which means they took the type trays and dumped them out in the street.
Yeah.
And that was the end of the Expositor. That's where Joseph probably overstepped his bounds by violating freedom of speech.
Yeah.
And within days, he's dead at Carthage. It was maybe 2 weeks later. I forget exactly the dates, but it's not long.
Yeah.
And it really got, newspapers in those days were really almost sacred. And you had newspapers in bigger cities, the Chicago Democrat and the Chicago Republican, and they followed those lines of political uh, affiliation almost, even though they were not technically, a part of those parties. But the editors lined themselves, and so in Nauvoo you had the Nauvoo Neighbor, which was the city newspaper, and then you had the Nauvoo Expositor try to come out as an alternative voice, and it was squashed. And so just down the river in Warsaw, Tom Sharp, in his Warsaw Signal, he was always against Joseph Smith anyway, and the potential political power of the city of Nauvoo. And you got these newcomers coming in a block like that. Longtime residents aren't going to be really happy.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard to fault Thomas Sharp completely. But newspapers were good at rabble raising. They get people all excited. Doesn't that still happen today? You get stuff running around on videos that go viral on
Absolutely.
YouTube or Facebook. It's kind of the same thing. And in my own country's political history, just in the last year and a half, we had similar kind of a rabble rousing that and they ended up attacking the Capitol building, and I think my my good friend, the British ambassador to Korea, and I were talking about Guy Fawkes Day the other day.
Oh,
And the even though that's a few hundred years ago, but the plot to blow up Parliament in London, and so that's this is just human nature, but Joseph wasn't having it, and he tried to put his foot down, but it was too little, too late. It would have been interesting had he continued to live, what kind of transformations, because the church between 1830 and 1844 had transformed itself time and again. I mean, it was just a total transformation over those years. If I lived longer, it would be interesting to see where it might have ended up, but that's a question we can only speculate on and never know.
Yeah, I think I don't know if the church did better because they had a martyr, or you know what I mean. If it would have,
Yeah,
which way it would
yeah,
have gone, was
right,
having
yeah.
a martyr to coalesce around, was that better for them? I'm not saying it was a good thing, you know.
No, no, no.
No,
I hear you. Yeah, that gives it's a powerful focus point
yeah,
for people to kind of cling on to something that unites them, and for the folks at Nauvoo and those who went west with Brigham Young, that was really a focal point for them,
yeah, yeah.
uh, and
Well, it stirred up a lot of strong
you know,
feeling as well.
yeah,
That kind of persecution complex
yeah,
almost stems
yeah, yeah,
from the early treatment of the saints.
right,
So, and I think in
yeah,
Mormonism that even comes through today, that anything said against the church is
yeah,
just a
yes,
continuation of that persecution.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah.
But I've just seen this one, and I'd not seen this one. The Church of Christ, chubby. I'm a chubby
Oh,
fella, so I'll ask about that.
yeah. No, he's not. He wasn't chubby at all. Well, I don't know. He may have been. That's a surname. Um, he he was probably mixed race, um, Native American and African
Okay.
slave stock, and he was kind of on again, off again with Brigham Young for a little while. Um, Openly began practicing polygamy, which even Brigham Young was uncomfortable with at that time. We're still in the 1845, 46, and it hadn't been publicly proclaimed, even though most people knew something was going on. Uh, Chubby married an Anglo woman, and she transformed herself into a Cherokee princess, and the two of them made quite a splash eventually in what should I call it, naturopathic medicine. Treating diseases with herbal remedies and things, which was not uncommon in the 1840s. Still, we still weren't using a lot of modern surgical chemical medications,
Hmm.
and they uh, they spent a number of years in Ohio, New York, Toronto, Ontario. Uh, and eventually, the two of them divorced and went separate ways. And she continued practicing medicine, and they were well known. But for the first few years, they actually had quite a gathering of people. And Chubby took a second wife, and some hard feelings and things like that got in the way, and which I quite honestly, PD, I can't conceive of having more than one wife
No.
because I couldn't live with even one. You know, and with all due respect to the good people who might be listening or watching, marriage at its very best is a challenge to the partners in that relationship.
Hmm.
And when you start expanding the relationship beyond the two people to three people or four people or five people, uh, your challenges grow exponentially. It's not just adding, one plus one plus one. It's so you know it. It's not surprising when we find that the first wife had some trouble with the second wife, and there was jealousies and things like that. And so that Chubby sort of they really kind of never followed through on a long term trajectory of Mormonism, but the Book of Mormon for them was the Native American book,
Yes.
and that's where they were with their faith.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, so following the William Law incident, the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, we get into 1844 to 1860, as you've designated it, the fragmentation era. And looking here, we can
yeah,
see you've got in the book 6 main kind of offshoots at this point. The Strangites,
yeah.
James Strang, with his own plates and his own. Was it the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon that
No, no,
he?
not Strang. No, his were the brass plates of Laban.
Okay,
Um, and then there was
uh,
another set of plates called the Vori plates, um, the record of Raja Manchu of Vori. So there were two plate books that he translated and produced.
yeah, and in the book, as Steve said earlier, these are some of the main offshoots, but then they fragment again later in time, and he's got each of the kind of subcategories from these main offshoots in there as well, and there are a lot, a lot
There,
of them.
during the fragmentation era, which begins after Joseph Smith's death and continued until the 1860s, there were 40 or 50 attempts at reforming the church. And by the time we get to early 1860s, there really were only 6 that survived from then until the 21st century.
Yeah,
And those are the 6 main groupings that I've come up with: Strang, Alpheus Cutler, Sidney Rigdon, which became the kind of the parent of the uh, William Bickerton's Church of Jesus Christ. Um, Brigham Young, of course, is one of those. And I do not subscribe to a smooth succession after Joseph Smith died. It was not set that the president of the 12 should automatically take over the church. And it didn't happen overnight. It happened after 3.5 years when Brigham finally said, I think we should reorganize the presidency. And the members of the 12 who followed him said, well, whatever you want, Brother Brigham, we'll go along with it. Um, and it wasn't that they were yes men necessarily. It was just, what else can we do?
yeah,
Um, but even Brigham Young himself never saw himself as a prophetic successor to Joseph. And he often in his early sermons, when that he would talk about that, in the Journal of Discourses, we have records of that. But those 6 main groups become then the parents of all the others
yeah,
uh, since the early part of the 20th century.
yeah. And if anyone is struggling to see the Brighamite sect, when this was put together, you can see down here the central line is assumed to be Joseph's original church up to 1844, and then the Brighamite sect going forwards.
Oh, is that how this guy's done that? Well, I have an argument with
Yeah.
that, but okay, fine.
Yeah,
We'll
that's how
take
they.
it as a visual, but not so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at
Oh,
that
that's
point,
what that's supposed to be.
I
Okay.
yeah, I'd have put them on a
Yeah.
separate line at that point, but that's how they've put it together.
Yeah.
Um,
I would not do it that way. I would have that the line stops uh, by the fall of 1844.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah,
um,
but okay, fine. It's a visual, so
yeah. So you've called the book the Smith-Rigdon movement. Why did you include Rigdon in there?
I having taken a really good hard look at history of American Christianity, the milieu of what was going on in the 1820s and 30s in eastern United States. The term even restoration was not part of Joseph Smith's original vocabulary. You look at the early revelations, and he never uses the word restoration. he talks about a great and marvelous work is about to come forth, and that was always understood to mean the Book of Mormon by the
Hmm.
early church people.
Yeah.
The term restoration movement is applied to Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, and their efforts, which began early in the 1800s to restore the New Testament first century Christian church. Joseph doesn't pick up on that theme until Smith-Rigdon teams up with him.
Oh, okay.
Smith-Rigdon was part of Alexander Campbell's organization. Well, it wasn't
Yes.
really an organization in the same sense of today, but Smith-Rigdon was a Baptist preacher, and we're talking old style Baptist, not Southern Baptist in the American expression.
Hmm.
Um, and he was a partner with Alexander Campbell. Uh, Rigdon often wrote in Alexander Campbell's church newspaper called the Millennial Harbinger. He often went on preaching visits and mission trips with Alexander Campbell. Um, and he was the bishop, Smith-Rigdon was the bishop of a whole district of those kinds of Baptist churches in the Kirtland, Ohio area until the summer of 1830, when Alexander Campbell and Smith-Rigdon came to loggerheads over the issue of communitarianism.
Okay.
Rigdon believed that all things in common was part of the New Testament church. Campbell said, no, that was just one expression at one, given time, and that wasn't for the whole church. And they finally just had enough with each other, and so Rigdon left. And so Rigdon is still the bishop of this group of churches that were all of a similar mindset with him. Part of Rigdon's oversight included Isaac Morley and the farm, which was just down the hill from where the Kirtland Temple now stands. The Morley farm and family, they were a communitarian society. Smith-Rigdon was training young men to become preachers in his style of interpretation of the Bible. Two of those young men's names were Parley P. Pratt and Orson Pratt. They were preachers in the Alexander Campbell Restoration movement. Another one was Edward Partridge. And those names would be familiar to any LDS folks who know anything about the Kirtland era.
Yeah.
So Parley Pratt is the one who became aware of the Book of Mormon, comes back to Kirtland with it, and says to Sidney, his mentor, you ought to take a look at this. This is interesting. And Sidney's first response, we know that from history, was, oh, come on. And after he read it, he had a change of heart, and he goes to Pennsylvania and spends the rest of the winter into spring with Joseph, and they're working on the inspired revision to the Bible, the Joseph Smith translation. Well, Smith-Rigdon was highly trained, educated. He was a man of book learning. He was a skilled preacher, orator, and could, explain the gospel and all of this very well. Joseph was not well educated. He had difficulty putting a full sentence together in proper grammar sometimes. And Sidney says to Joseph over the winter, you really ought to move to Ohio, where I'm at. Plenty of good farmland, and I've got lots of people there. Sidney's group of people were almost 1,000 in half a dozen or so different congregations. And Joseph eventually says, yeah. So Joseph's little group of 100 people merges with Sidney's group of 1,000 people. And Sidney becomes, by revelation, becomes the spokesperson to the prophet in one of Joseph's revelations. And what he says is what God says, is what I say is what God says. And so then we learned that Sidney actually was the one who wrote the lectures on faith, of course with Joseph's approval, but Sidney was the one that put pen to paper and articulated those 6 lectures, which used
Yes.
to be part of the Doctrine and Covenants. And they were the lectures used in the School of the Prophets to teach the leaders of the church. I think it was 8 or 9 of the original 12 apostles were all Sidney-Rigdon's people. So the church became more Sidney's church than it did Joseph's church in a manner of looking at it. And so rather than calling it the Latter-day Saint movement, which many churches on the chart to this day would not really acknowledge that terminology, and rather than just calling it simply the Restoration movement, the Smith-Rigdon movement seemed to make sense just as scholarly, not a faith name, but a scholarly working academic name for the movement. Just as in the Disciples of Christ and so on, it's called the Stone Campbell movement, Barton Stone, Alexander Campbell. It's not what the people call themselves. Many of them might just call themselves Campbellites. But Alexander Campbell's really antagonistic anti-Book of Mormon pamphlet that was published in 1831 is more of a, he was so upset with Sidney-Rigdon more than anything else that it comes out as a critique of the Book of Mormon. Because Sidney-Rigdon took away a significant portion of people that had been following Campbell's principles.
I was going to say 1,000 people back then.
Well, indeed, and you're out in the countryside, I mean, we're way out of civilization. It was called the Western Reserve. It was barely organized as a state by the time this all gets going. So I think it just makes common sense from an academic viewpoint to refer to the movement that way rather than co-opting the word restoration, which again is not limited to even Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone. That whole restoration of the original church movement started way back in the probably, even with the Anabaptists back in the late 1500s in Europe. So it was a long, drawn out kind of a movement. The Puritans, the folks that came to North America on the Mayflower, that was a restoration movement too. They wanted to get rid of the gilded rubbish in the church.
Yeah,
because that wasn't in the New Testament. I'm borrowing Oliver Cromwell's terminology for all the stuff that was on the altar in the church. He called it gilded rubbish. So for just Joseph Smith's people to say, "Oh, we're the Restoration Movement," it's not really a good academic term that helps identify it clearly. So that's where I'm coming from with that.
Yeah.
But I did keep the title original to the first edition by calling it Divergent Paths of the Restoration.
Yes.
Because when I wrote the first edition, I only knew about us.
Yeah.
I wasn't really knowledgeable about the rest of it all.
So if I can ask, where do you stand on the situation that obviously in the Brighamite sect people go back to as the moment where Brigham was chosen, and that was when he was speaking and took upon him, I guess, the image of Joseph.
Yeah. Well, not everybody saw that. There were several hundred people in the grove at Nauvoo during that meeting. People didn't really talk about, and the few people that did talk about it, it wasn't until later. At that meeting, Brigham was not voted to be the successor to Joseph Smith. The 12 were sustained in their office and calling, and Sidney-Rigdon was sustained as a counselor to that presidency.
Okay.
And that gets lost in the Utah LDS telling of the story. So Sidney was not rejected. he wanted to be called the guardian of the church, and they said, "Nah, we're going to just sustain the 12 in their office and calling as the temporary presidency of the church. And Sidney, you still will be the counselor in the presidency like you have been." And that wasn't good enough for Sidney. And within a few weeks, Brigham Young excommunicated Sidney. Sidney returned the favor and excommunicated Brigham Young. And so, who had any authority at that point?
Yeah.
Now, Sidney was not, by that point in his life, something happened to him in the Liberty jail. I think he probably had a nervous breakdown. We don't have any medical way to determine that. But he wasn't the same Sidney after that he had been in the early years of Kirtland.
Okay.
He no longer had that preaching power that he used to have. And so, he was no competition. And the church organization, and there were two at different times afterwards, he pulled off a large group of people, but I don't think it was ever more than 1,000. And he was, but in his first rendition of church, which was first called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then later shortened to Church of Christ, William Bickerton was baptized and became a member of Sidney Rigdon's Grand Council, which was an equivalent to the Council of 50 that Joseph had done. And then when Rigdon's church organization fell apart, Bickerton and his colleagues were kind of left without a church. They had missionaries from Utah come through, and they hadn't known about them very much before. And so they joined the Salt Lake group and then found out within days about polygamy and left immediately and continued for several years on their own until Bickerton goes out and prays about it and has a visionary experience similar to Joseph's experience in the Grove. And he reorganizes the church. In the first few years, his church was called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and their church paper was called the Ensign back in 1850-60.
Okay.
And they continue to this day.
Fantastic. So at this recently, there's been a documentary speaking about the martyrdom of Joseph Smith and going over the details, and it has, I say, alluded to the fact that it has accused church leaders of actually organizing the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, and that it was John Taylor and Willard Richards, who were in the cell with him, who actually performed that in order to remove Joseph and create this opportunity for Brigham to take over the church in that respect. Have you heard of any of that?
I've heard of that, yes. I've heard of that. I know some of the principles that were involved in that. And, all I can say is that, well, it makes for a very tantalizing tale.
Yeah, it was.
For conspiracy theorists. I'm hard pressed to accept that theory. But I'm open to any evidence that might prove otherwise. I find it hard to take at face value.
Yeah. Okay.
And Dallin Oaks, way back, before he was even BYU president. I mean, we're going back a long time. I think when he was still teaching at the University of Chicago, wrote a book called The Carthage Conspiracy. And that book pretty well debunks a lot of that. And this is old stuff. So, okay, he was a faithful, follower of the Brigham Young expression of the movement. But he was a very competent researcher and writer too. I have a hard time with that theory.
Okay. Well, if we fast forward to the 1920s, we've got the Second Declaration, and here we've got a large kind of offshoot, the Council of Friends, and this then splinters into the fundamentalist polygamous sects that we have today.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
I previously interviewed a member of the work and that's
Okay.
part of the FLDS that splintered off.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and he was speaking about this event in 1920 with John Taylor,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
there was, I guess, a blessing given according to these brethren, and they
Right.
were charged with keeping the sacred everlasting covenant of marriage going
Right.
until the government relinquished, I guess, control of the church and accepted polygamy again, and then they would
Yeah.
bring it back to
Right.
the Brighamite sect. Can you
Right.
tell us anything about that, I guess, offshoot?
Well, uh, the polygamy did not stop with the 1890 manifesto. That manifesto, Wilford Woodruff, who succeeded John Taylor as president and leader of the LDS Church, he basically said, we don't practice it in Utah. And many church authorities, officials were going down to Mexico and getting married plurally, or they were taking ships off the coast of California out past the international boundary and getting married on ship. So it was still happening. And so you ended up with additional manifestos along the way. Finally, 1920 is an interesting time period. The new editions of the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price were published in 1920. There were a lot of changes to what had been, not that the content was changed so much, but the way it was presented. The temple rituals were changed. Um, and So, for whatever reason, the Woolley brothers and some of their cohorts who still believed in polygamy, and it was not a narrow group of people that still practiced or believed in it, it was pretty widespread. Um, when finally, the church just put a stop to it completely, and you had two apostles that were excommunicated because they had practiced polygamy, even though their marriages had taken place outside of Utah. Um, and so they get together, this like-minded group of friends, and have a meeting. It was in Salt Lake City. What do we do, brethren? And Lauren Woolley ordained several of these people to this special priesthood office um, of high priest apostle, um, kind of a
Okay.
way of saying it. And they were uh, they were bound to each other to continue the practice of the sacred everlasting covenant. Um, and it quickly devolved into lots of bickering over who had authority and what. It's the same question that has plagued the church from the beginning.
Yeah.
Who has the authority to receive revelation and whatnot? And so, even among the Woolley group of 7 high priest apostles, um, there were divisions very quickly emerged about, this guy, the leader died, and so in Short Creek down on the Utah Arizona border, they ordained the next guy to be the leader, but the Salt Lake folks didn't accept that, and so they ordained a different guy, and then accusations went back and forth, and then down in Colorado City,
Yeah.
Short Creek, uh, uh, the Leroy Johnson decided to just not call new people to the council, and he'd been in charge down there for decades. And he basically set up a first presidency like, as the critics called it, the one man rule. And his successor, Rulon Jeffs, was persuaded to incorporate the organization as the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints.
Mhm.
And Jeffs was in turn succeeded by his son Warren Jeffs. And it was at the time of incorporation under Rulon, and a little bit before that, the people in Centennial Park which
Yeah.
is the work. They said, no, we're not going to go with this one man rule business. We need to have the council. And so um, Alma, uh, oh dear, Timpson, and what was the other surname? It escapes me I can't
It's
think of it. I
okay.
apologize. You look it up in the book.
Yes.
And Centennial Park, which is just across the highway from the Short Creek communities, the Hilldale, Utah, Colorado City, Arizona communities. They've been really successful, and they quietly go about doing their thing. And I've driven through there, and they've got their own school. The houses are just absolutely gigantic.
Mm,
But I think many of the men have, if not all, at least some of their wives living in the same house. Because some of those houses, 2 and 3 stories high, must have, you know, 10, 15, 20,000 square feet of living space. They're gigantic. And
yeah.
they build them all themselves, and they've become well known in the construction business in that part of the United States. And uh, often you'll see a lot of them and some of the other folks at Colorado City with construction companies doing huge construction projects in Las Vegas, which is only 2 hours drive away.
Yeah.
Um, so the fundamentalist church, which has most of the folks in Hilldale and Colorado City, lots of trouble over Warren Jeffs' leadership and allegations against him that were proven in court.
Yeah.
He still remains the prophetic leader, but he's in jail. And
Yeah.
so a lot of their properties were taken into receivership by a state appointed person who's not a member of any of the churches because they were living all things in common. But Jeffs was, got somebody who got mad at him, and so he'd just take away the guy's house and family.
Hmm.
And so that's been really disruptive for the community. And in fact, uh, one of the young men, uh, uh, oh dear, I'm sorry, my mind doesn't. Willie,
It's okay.
dear, he was the bishop. Willie Jessup, I think it was. He was the bishop under Warren Jeffs, and he's got a group now that's meeting independently with him as their bishop. He doesn't claim to be the prophetic successor or anything. Up in Salt Lake City, you have the Apostolic United Brethren, which has stayed pretty unified. They were led for many years by uh, Rulon C. Allred, and then Rulon Allred's brother Marvin, and then down the line they built temples and actually began practicing again temple rituals separate from the LDS Church, which for a long time they were all against. They were saying, no, we're not the church. We're excluded from the temple, but you know, Thomas S. Monson, Russell Nelson, whoever it is still president of the church. They just don't have priesthood authority to do plural marriages.
Yeah.
But the Apostolic United Brethren in their kind of their headquarters area in the southern part of Salt Lake Valley, they have an endowment house or a temple, and
Yeah.
they've over the last 20 years gone to doing the full. Now the endowment ritual that they do would probably be unfamiliar to most modern LDS folks because they're using an older version.
Yeah.
And they built a temple down in Mexico as well, in a community down there. Happens to be on Joseph Smith Avenue in the town of Ozumba, Mexico. But
Wow.
it's really quite I mean, it's a nice facility, and they've been doing endowments there for maybe 30 years or so. But recently, even the Apostolic United Brethren have been broken up over who has the authority because certain traditions weren't observed exactly the same way, and um, so it's just you get humans involved in things, and just like we were talking earlier about the folks in the ward who didn't want to move their chair inside the chapel.
Yeah.
You know, we have our ideas. We want our ideas to have meaning. We want our lives to have meaning. And you know, Joseph Smith opened it up. He said anybody can approach God and get, you know, inspiration. And so here we have about 500 expressions of the movement in my book that I've been able to catalog, uh, and about 120 of them still operating today.
Yeah.
Um, and in almost every case, there's some prophetic leader who claims direction from God. And as I said earlier, I've met lots of these people. I find most of them to be absolutely sincere and rational and believable people. Um, so, you know, who am I to say that this one is right or that one is wrong? I know, no, I can't even say that I know. I'm where it's right for me in my experience of 40 years.
Yeah.
And some of my friends in these other expressions, it's right for them for their, you know, wherever they've been for the last 40 or 50 years of their lives. So
Yeah.
um, I, I, I try to, you know, give people the benefit of doubt. Um, it and you either choose to go that route or you choose to reject faith in anything at all. I think I'm not sure there's anything in between.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
but
and
life is not like that. So
yeah.
yeah,
Well, having interviewed, it was Clayne Wademan. If anyone wants to see that interview, I'll put the link just above now. But he was saying, like you were saying about the construction and different things, that
yeah,
he lived in one house with all the mothers and 50 other children. And,
yeah.
you know, it was once you were 12 or 13, you went out on the construction sites.
Went
All
to
the money,
work. Yeah,
all the money went to dad to upkeep the
right,
houses and etc. and
right.
was kept within the congregation. And yeah, they lived that way. An interesting
You
thing he
think
said
your
was,
energy bills are high now, huh?
yeah. Well, an
Can you
interesting thing he said was,
imagine feeding 50 children? Wow.
yeah. Well, his dad then got another 15. He was
Yeah,
given, because much like earlier we were saying, you never say no to a calling. When you're in the
right.
polygamous sect, you never say no to a wife,
That's
because
right. Yeah,
the wife has been given by God. And this was
right.
a widow with 15 children.
Yeah,
So his dad
yeah.
got another 15 children. He was saying that his granddad, who also had 13 wives, now had 1,000 offspring.
Oh
um,
my. Wow.
when you go down through
Yeah.
grandchildren and great grandchildren, which was amazing. But he said that they struggle with the ecosystem because you still have
Yeah.
prophets, or you still have 80-year-old apostles marrying
Right.
18-year-old girls,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
then you have 30-year-old brethren who don't have any wives because
Wives at all. Yeah.
there aren't enough sisters to go around.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
So it's just interesting that that still happens today.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I think another amazing one that I saw, and that comes out of the church in Africa, and with the priesthood ban, and the fact that the missionaries setting up wards or branches in Africa, and then the church almost not pulling out of Africa, but there weren't enough white brethren to keep up with the growth of the church.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the African brethren broke off and formed their own sects with their own priesthood.
Right. Yeah. There have
And
been three or four of those at least,
yeah,
you know, in Western Africa. I'm sure there are more, but we just haven't come across them yet.
yeah,
You know, in Europe, where you know there's a significant population of Smith-Rigdon people, um, you know, and I've only come across a handful
yeah,
of alternative expressions. Um, there's got to be more out there. It's language is a different challenge. These days, internet savvy, may or may not be. And I can't keep track on the internet of all the different stuff that goes on that's related to everything but the official mainstream LDS church. There's thousands of websites
Yeah.
promoting some facet, uh, there's several that were promoting kind of a Hebrew Mormonism kind of a thing with a Passover ritual based on the Book of Mormon rather than the Old Testament, and there's just so many. And so what I have in the book that are basically internet expressions are just a small sample.
Yeah.
It's just no physical location, and internet websites come and go, at the drop of a pin, and there's just no way to keep track of all of it, I don't think.
No. Well, I'm impressed that
Right.
whoever put this graphic together has the School of the Prophets in the early 1980s, which I think
Yeah.
is the Lafferty movement, which
But it's not Lafferty. It's Robert Crossfield,
okay.
with who the Laffertys were part of him.
Okay.
And then they split, and the Laffertys had their own, and the murders and all of that came out. But this
Okay. Yeah.
one in the 80s would be Robert Crossfield,
Okay.
who was a Canadian who moved to Idaho and then ended up in Utah. And Robert Crossfield issued more than 200 revelations that have all been printed. Lafferty's came into that organization the late 80s, early 90s,
I think
maybe.
the murders
Later
were
than
1984.
1984.
Yeah.
Okay, so they were right early on then. Okay, so
Yeah.
they were probably at about the time that Crossfield moved to Utah.
Yeah.
He was down in Salem, Utah, which is the southern end of Utah Valley. The Laffertys were living in the northern end of Utah Valley.
Yeah.
And so they joined right early when he moved down there from Idaho then. Okay.
Well, I think
Yeah.
because obviously Under the Banner of Heaven's just aired on
Yeah.
Hulu, so that's a big thing at the moment in the States. And obviously,
Right.
the TV show doesn't cover the whole movement of the School of the Prophets, just the Lafferty section of that.
Yeah.
But something
Right.
it brought out was, and something that you've got in the book, was the one mighty and strong revelation.
Yes.
And that for a lot of these movements, the one mighty and strong revelation has been almost the catalyst
Yes.
for brethren to stand up and declare themselves or be declared the one mighty and strong.
I am in. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's probably one thing that shot Joseph's church in the foot when he gave that.
Yeah.
Giving people the opportunity to declare themselves.
Right.
And
Right.
I wonder if he was speaking about himself, that there would be some future event, but it's just been misinterpreted over the years as being.
Even Alpheus Cutler's people still today are looking for that. They call him the Moses man in everyday parlance, but it's the one mighty and strong that they're talking about. And they had a guy in the 70s that came to them, and they accepted him, and then he declared himself to be mighty and strong, and they were done with him. But yeah, it's there have been dozens of people over the last almost 200 years now of the movement who have either self-declared or have been declared by followers, or have been wondered about if they might not be the one mighty and strong. The Elijah Message people, for example, they believe that it's John the Baptist that's the one mighty and strong. And it was John the Baptist who visited their man, Otto Fetting, in 28 or 29? And And subsequently, several others have had visitations from John the Baptist until there's been 120 plus messages dictated by John the Baptist to different people. And now there's more than 120. There's got to be 300 or 400 if I stop and think about it. But for that whole group of people, John the Baptist is the one mighty and strong that came in the last days. So when is the last days? That's really the question. Was Joseph Smith in the last days?
Yeah,
or was 100 years later the last days? Or are we now in the last days?
Yeah.
An interesting bit of trivia is that about 15 years ago here in Asia, the LDS Church changed their name.
Okay.
Now, in English, it's still the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But in Chinese characters, which are the foundational vocabulary roots.
Oh, we seem to have lost Steve. Bear with me. Bear with me. You're back. It's okay.
We've timed out. I see the timer up in the corner. It's like, Steve, you just put it in gear and you never stop.
It's okay.
The name of the Utah folks here in all of the world is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with a hyphen and a small d, which is the British convention of spelling. But the Chinese characters, which are the basis for vocabulary in many of the Asian languages, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, and Chinese in the mainland, Chinese in Taiwan, Chinese in Hong Kong. The Chinese characters for latter days used to imply end of the world.
Okay.
And in 2005, they changed those two Chinese characters to mean later time period. So they moved away from that millennialistic end of the world language here. Now, it still translates the same back and forth, except the Chinese characters have meaning in and of themselves. And so now the LDS Church in most of Asia is called the Church of Jesus. Let's see. It's the Church of Jesus Christ, later time period saints, instead of end of the world saints. That is a dramatic shift in theology.
Yeah, it is.
A dramatic shift in theology. And I know here in Korea, it caused several thousand LDS folks to walk away from the church. Because, wait a minute, we've been taught the second coming was nigh, and now you're telling us that we're not in the end of the world. We're now just in a later time period.
Wow.
The Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price were also issued in new translations, at least here in Korea, in the same year. And the translations are really well done, but they put it in modern Korean vernacular instead of the archaic literary Korean. And so the words of the sacrament prayers, for example, are different. The meaning's still the same. The English is still the same, but the words, the vocabulary used to express those in Korean was changed to be more up-to-date vocabulary. And the LDS folks here they were, many of them weren't having it.
Wow.
And I don't know if the same thing happened in Japan and in Taiwan or in Hong Kong, but it was the change was dramatic. And I'm not up to date on Chinese language translations of the scriptures. I'm fluent in Korean, and so I know the Korean and I know some of that goes on, and I can read the websites that have the new translations on them. And when I was a kid 50 years ago here, it would have been so wonderful to have that new translation, because the translation we had to use of the Book of Mormon was so archaic. Nobody knew what it said. It was done in high level literary. It's like the King James version of the Bible as opposed to the revised English version.
Yeah.
Very different. So, are there groups here in Korea that maybe have organized separately? Could very well be. I don't know how to track them down. And, I did find one guy back when I was a 20-year-old missionary that had started his own, LDS version of a church, and he's in the book. Um, so, wherever there's people that are thinking and praying, there's going to be different answers come up. And,
Well, yeah. Well,
different ways of expressing faith.
I guess the last two I want to touch on. One in 2007, the Latter-day Church of Jesus Christ, and for legal reasons, that's now changed to the Restored Branch of Jesus Christ.
Right, in England there.
Yeah, here in Derbyshire in England with Matthew Gill. I've
Matthew Gill.
previously interviewed him as well, and I'll put the link just up
Okay.
above right
Yep,
now.
yep.
But that was
Yep.
interesting to me because
Yes.
I have a lot of personal experience with Matthew Gill, and I felt like he
Okay.
was, or when I say personal experience, I'd never met Matthew Gill, but I know a lot of people around Matthew Gill. He was in the neighboring ward to me for a long time, and
I see. Okay.
also grew up in a ward where I lived later in life. So I knew a lot of secondhand contemporary stories of Matthew and his story. But the interesting thing there was he felt like the most, for me at least, the best analog of Joseph Smith still alive today, in the fact that he claims to have received plates, to have received the Urim and Thummim, and to have made translations of those plates
Right.
to accompany the Book of Mormon, etc.
Yep.
So I thought
Yes.
that one was interesting. Is he in the book? I'd not got.
Yes. Yeah. Matthew Gill's in the book, and I can't remember the timing of the change of the name. It may not be the current name. It may be the Latter-day Church of.
I think
the Latter-day, however that was.
Yeah, he was basically saying the church hit him with a large lawsuit when he called himself the Latter-day Church of Christ.
Yeah, not surprising.
But he does watch. So hello, Matthew. You're in the book, so go get a copy of it and look yourself up. And then finally, the remnant and the Snufferites, who are growing in popularity.
Yes.
And I see Snuffer as kind of a Brigham Young, in the fact that he didn't declare himself at first to be a prophet, etc. He broke from the church, and then when they excommunicated him, he then took upon himself a mantle, a prophetic mantle.
Yeah. It's been interesting to watch his group go through 2 or 3 revisions of the scriptures. One of the earlier renditions of their scriptures had lots of stuff that Snuffer, revelations from Snuffer, and they'd added lots of things to the Old Testament, for example. And then a lot of that stuff got taken out in a later version of the scriptures. And, the basic texts are the Old and New Testament, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants. But a lot of stuff from him that was in the first renditions of those books are not in the later renditions. And, that there may be some wisdom. You kind of have to be careful about changing the Bible and adding the wisdom of Joseph Smith and Denver Snuffer to the Old Testament. And I'm not quoting that exactly right, so I'm not meaning to demean Denver and the work of his folks. Doing an edition of the scriptures is a massive undertaking. And when you have a prophetic leader, as Denver Snuffer is for his people, just as Joseph Smith continued to add to the canon of scripture over his lifetime, we should normally expect that any successors of his would do the same. And I think that, in Community of Christ, the successors of Joseph Smith have continued to add to the Doctrine and Covenants. We're up to section 165 now. I was at Sunstone a few years ago, and I made reference to section 160 something, and some sister in the group that was listening was, well, there's not 160 sections. And I said, well, which edition are you referring to? She says, well, the Doctrine and Covenants. And I held them up and I said, which one? So, if Denver Snuffer's a prophet, fine. If he receives revelation, fine. He has perfect right to add or modify or adjust the scriptures, just as Joseph Smith had when he was revising the Bible.
Yeah.
So, that, yeah.
Yeah, Matthew Gill's got over 200 sections now of the
Right.
Doctrine and Covenants, and they removed around 30 of the sections from the Brighamite sect because they couldn't be confirmed to be from Joseph Smith.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So
yeah.
things like
I have not kept up to date with him and the versions of the scriptures. Early on, I got the Book of Jeranek, so my entry on him may be a bit dated and probably needs to have some input on it. So anyway, all these scriptures that are running out there are worthy of reading, and you judge for yourself. I mean, that's
fantastic.
Anyway, yeah.
Great. Well, our time is fast spent, but I think
sorry. Yes,
it's okay. No, I think it's been well spent.
Edit it down. PD, I've enjoyed chatting with you. I'd love to be in the same room with you, and we could probably talk for days on end.
Yeah, no, it's been great. I've really enjoyed it because it's just such an interesting area because it's so everything not approved by Deseret Book or by the brethren in Salt Lake is downtrodden, and I'm sure if they could, they'd burn it all. Because
some might. I don't think they all would, but some might want to. Yes.
But I think it's a great PR kind of effort over 100 years that they've done to be able to not even have to make any effort to brand everything not from church as anti-Mormon, even the good stuff. If it's not on the church website or if it doesn't have the church's logo stamped on the back, then it's unapproved and it's wrong.
It's unapproved. Yep.
But I think we've had a good rummage around. Everyone, please go out, use the link in the description below to get yourself a copy of Steve's book, The Divergent Paths of the Restoration, an Encyclopedia of the Smith-Rigdon Movement, because it's fantastic. I will continue reading, and I hope you will continue, if you've got the time, revising as new movements come and go. Maybe President Uchtdorf will finally get his way and start his own little movement here in Europe. I think that would be amazing to see an actual apostle.
Yeah, I like him very much. He's got such a great personality and a good grasp of what life's about. He's a unique. He's the only one that's not a lawyer or a banker among the group.
Yeah, I think
it's great.
When they called him, did they call Bednar at the same time? And I think those two.
I can't remember.
Yeah. Those two could not be further apart on the.
They're very different.
Kind of liberal scale.
Yeah, very different.
But no. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Steve. Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Steve, for all of your time. That was one of our longest episodes here at Priesthood Dispatches, and I'm sure it was one of the most informative as well. Definitely go out and get a copy of Steve's book. Now to the Priesthood Dispatches Paranormal Investigation. We have a 400-year-old pub here in the UK where there have been confirmed supernatural events. And what we want to do is we want to go along with all the night vision cameras and electric voice recorders that apparently pick up apparitions, etc. And we want to put to those apparitions some distinctly Mormon phraseology, maybe passwords and different things. And we want to take an 1830s Book of Mormon. We have a replica to see if there's a particular page they want to talk about, and possibly call upon Joseph or Moroni or other Mormon figures that have gone before us. So we're trying to raise a couple $100 to do that. If you can spare anything, that'd be amazing. Use the PayPal link in the description below. Or if you've got a suggestion of an item we should take or a question that we should ask to the spirits there, then leave a comment down below and we'll try and do that. That's looking like it's going to be sometime in July. So fingers crossed we can get everything sorted and together for that. But for now, I've been PD. Steve was great, and we'll see you all on the next one. Bye.